Welcome to a Rice University podcast. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
Good evening. As everyone is finishing finding a seat, I'm going to take the opportunity to welcome you to tonight's Bachner Lecture, an annual event that honors the memory of Solomon Bachner, the illustrious mathematician and historian of science who was associated with Rice from 1968 until his death in 1982. My name is Susan McIntosh, and I'm the director of Scientia, the Institute for the History of Science and Culture that Solomon Bachner co-founded in 1981. Scientia presents an annual lecture series along with film showings and panel discussions on related topics, and this year our theme has been biopolitics. We've construed this theme very broadly, encompassing topics ranging from the biological substrate of political preference, the green campus movement, the politics of teaching evolution, and the engagement of scientists in the political process of policy making. Tonight, however, we turn to a more specific meaning of biopolitics, as the term was originated by the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Central to Foucault's two related concepts of biopower and biopolitics is the notion that modern institutions affect the control and regulation of large and diverse populations, in part via the techniques, technologies, and practices of public health and regulation of heredity and the body, all of which emphasize the protection and enhancement of life of the population. In the 20th century, psychology and psychiatry are examples of expertise and practice that have played a significant role in making it possible to govern individuals, families, groups, and populations in liberal democracies. Our speaker tonight has been one of the most influential theorists to develop the idea of biopolitics further, speaking of the politics of life itself as, quote, concerned with our growing capacities to control, manage, engineer, reshape, and modulate the very vital capacities of human beings as living creatures, end quote. He continues to break new ground with his examination of neurobiology and its new technologies, asking how will these change our ideas of who we are and the ways in which we govern ourselves and are governed by others. Nikolas Rose is the James Martin White Professor of Sociology and the director of the London School of Economics' Biocenter for the Study of Bioscience, Biomedicine, Biotechnology, and Society, founded in 2003. He was previously professor of sociology at Goldsmiths College, where he had been head of the Department of Sociology. He was originally trained as a biologist before he switched to psychology and then to sociology. In 1989, he founded the History of the Present Research Network, an international network of researchers whose work has been influenced by the writings of Michel Foucault. Together with Paul Rabineau, he recently edited the fourth volume of Michel Foucault's essential works. From 1996 to 2004, he was managing editor of Economy and Society, one of Britain's leading scholarly interdisciplinary journals of the social sciences. He edits a Cambridge University Press book series on society and the life sciences with Paul Rabineau of UC Berkeley, and is co-editor with Anne Harrington of Harvard of Biosocieties, an interdisciplinary journal for social studies of neuroscience, genomics, and the life sciences published for the London School of Economics by Cambridge University Press. Professor Rose has published widely on the social and political history of the human sciences, on the genealogy of subjectivity, on the history of empirical thought in sociology, and on changing rationalities and techniques of political power. His books include The Psychological Complex, Psychology, Politics, and Society in England, 1869 to 1939, published by Routledge in 1984. Inventing Ourselves, Psychology, Power, and Personhood, Cambridge University Press, 1996. Powers of Freedom, Reframing Political Thought, Cambridge University Press. And The Politics of Life Itself, Biomedicine, Power, and Subjectivity in the 21st Century, published by Princeton University Press in 2006. His work has been translated into 10 languages. His current research concerns biological and genetic psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience and its social, ethical, cultural, and legal implications. And it is on this research that he will address us tonight with a much-anticipated lecture entitled Neuropolitics in the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rose to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for that introduction. And thank you in particular, Susan McIntosh, and to all my hosts for inviting me here to Houston. It's my first visit to Texas, my first visit to Rice University, and it's a real honor to give this Bochner lecture in your Scientia series on biopolitics. As Susan indicated, for some years now, I've been trying to map the new politics of the life sciences that's taking shape in the 21st century. That is to say, looking at the intertwining of developments in biology and biomedicine with developments in practices of governing. I've been trying to trace the alliances, the transactions between our developing ability to know and to manipulate fundamental processes of living organisms and the way in which many authorities, not just those called political, seek to shape and conduct our lives. As Susan mentioned in the introduction, I've termed this in the title of my 2006 book, The Politics of Life Itself. But what I want to do tonight is not to rehearse the themes of that book, which was written over an 8-year period and now rather distant from me, but to try and explore some of those issues by focusing on one specific area, that's to say the area of the new brain sciences, and what I term neuropolitics. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the ways in which this has been used in American political science, I don't mean by neuropolitics the neurobiological basis of political decision-making. I mean something a little different, which I'll show you in a moment. So, well, these are just pictures that will illustrate something which I'm sure many of you already know, which is that by the first decade of the 21st century, the human brain had become the focal point of multiple attempts to understand both pathological and normal human conduct, and to intervene on a whole range of zones from child rearing to the military. We see a quite spectacular rise in the number of papers published in the neurosciences over the half century from 1958 to 2008. By 2008, in that 1 year alone, over 26,000 scholarly papers in peer-reviewed journals were published in the neurosciences. A daunting field for a neuroscientist to keep up with, and a very, very daunting field for a poor sociologist to keep up with. Now, no doubt the huge rise in the recent decade was sparked by the decade of the brain, announced by George Bush in 1990, or perhaps the rise from the 1960s was sparked by the birth of neuroscience, which, as I'll say in a moment, happened in 1962, if one wants to date it precisely. We certainly see the impact of these arguments in psychiatry, where many people argue that the future of psychiatry in the 21st century is neuropsychiatry. Here's from the US Surgeon General's report on mental health in 1999. And I've just highlighted this because it just indicates some of the ways in which styles of thought are developing. But if you just look at the words that I've put in highlighted in red there, you'll see something rather interesting. Certain things are mediated by the brain, certain things reflect neurobiological processes, and certain things, about 10 words later, clearly reflect those neurobiological processes. Beyond the area of psychiatry, in the realms of normality, if I can use that much contested term, we see the rise of social and affective neuroscience, which argues that in order to understand how human beings engage in their most basic social interactions, from understanding one another's intentions to feeling fellow feeling and empathy with one another, one needs to look to the brain. Excuse me, despite the advances in biomedicine over the last couple of decades, I've still got the most terrible chest, so you'll please excuse me. I'll try not to expire before the end of this lecture, although that would be an interesting demonstration in and of itself. But let's hope we don't even go there. And in addition, we see, well, perhaps this isn't quite the right word, but what one might think of as a kind of neurocolonization, where the neurosciences, or at least some advocates who claim to base themselves on the neurosciences, argue that to understand domains that were previously understood in spiritual terms, in social terms, or in psychological terms, one should look to the brain. We see neurolaw, we see neuroeconomics, we see neuropsychiatry, as I've already said, we see neuroaesthetics, we see neuropolitics, which I mentioned a little bit earlier on, that particular idea of neuropolitics, we see neuromarketing, and a whole lot else. So my aim tonight is, in a very broad brush way, to trace the emergence of the style of thought which I think underpins this way of thinking and acting. And I put my investigations in this area under the heading of biopolitics, about which I need to say very little because Susan already introduced this general theme in her opening remarks. But for me, biopolitics is more of a sensitizing concept than an analytical concept, if I can put it like that. It opens up to our inspection a range of phenomena that were previously, if not obscured, split up between a number of different disciplines. It opens this dimension of reality, which is about the management of human conduct, individually and collectively, through acting on their vital powers. It opens up that for our analysis. It opens up the way in which we see, well, certainly in the countries of Europe and of North America over 200 years, the increasing salience, political salience of questions of reproduction, of questions of life, of death, of population density, of population size, of normality and pathology, of treatment and cure. Perhaps even, as they used to say about the British National Health Service, everything about human lives from cradle to grave. Except now we go a little bit before the cradle in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and a little bit after the grave in terms of organ transplantation. So this is the field that I mean when I use the term biopolitics. And working with Paul Rabinow, trying to clarify some of the uses of this term, Rabinow and I argued that in this biopolitical field, you see a linking together of three different kinds of questions. And the first is a question of truth. What kinds of things are in the true? What kinds of things can be said truthfully? Secondly, and intrinsically related to that, a question of authority. Who has the power to pronounce the truth? And in what practices do they pronounce the truth, and with what implications? And thirdly, a question of subjectivity, by which I mean a kind of ethic, a kind of what Weber would call a Lebensführung, a way of living your life, and the values that govern an individual and a collective as they live their lives. Truth, authority, and subjectivity. So, in neuropolitics, I suggest, one should look for these three intertwining axes of truth, of authority, and of subjectivity. Now, in my earlier work, which I've taken the liberty of putting a little picture of that book, but only because the best part of that book, and the only reason for buying it really, it's got a beautiful picture by Paul Klee on the front cover, which I was very, very pleased to get, but leave that to one side. In that book, I argued, drawing rather explicitly on Michel Foucault's wonderful book, Birth of the Clinic, that if you were trying to see the emergence of something new, in his case the clinical gaze, in my case what I guess one might call the neuromolecular gaze, if one's trying to see the emergence of this kind of event, don't look for a single point of origin. trace it along a number of intertwining pathways, because that which is an event emerges out of the intersection, often of things which have no intrinsic relationship to one another. So I suggested these 5 rather unflatteringly named pathways: molecularization, which I mean something about control; optimization, which I would now call something about governing the future; expertise, bioeconomics, and subjectification, by which I mean the birth of a certain kind of ethics. And that's what I call the politics of life itself. And I'm going to use those 5 axes to just say a little bit over the next 40 minutes or so about how I think one might begin to understand what's going on in the contemporary field of neuro. And I suppose underlying this whole argument, there's a rather simple question, or perhaps even a hypothesis. In my earlier work, I argued that the 20th century was the century of psi, of psychological knowledges, of psychological forms of expertise, and indeed of a psychological way of understanding ourselves as deep, interiorized psychological creatures. So the question, I suppose, that guides my current work is, will the 21st century be the century of neuro? And to slightly distort and paraphrase a little phrase of Sigmund Freud, where psi was, will neuro soon be. So let's get on with these 5 axes, and let me try and convince you that there is at least something worth thinking about going on here. And the first, and perhaps the most fundamental axis, is indeed a mutation at the level of truth. It's a mutation in the very scale at which we understand living processes, and the very scale at which we understand them in order to intervene in them. And I've argued that this scale should be understood in terms of a movement from a molar to a molecular image of life, the emergence of a molecular style of thought. In these pictures here, well, I put some rather famous images of what I mean by a molar style of thought, which sees the body as a whole, as a system, as indeed a system of systems made up of organs, which you visualize at that kind of level as you cut into the body and strip away its layers level by level by level. I don't know if that wonderful exhibition that we had in the UK called Spectacular Bodies came here to you, which showed that so beautifully about the body. If not, then you might have seen Gunther von Hagen's Body Worlds, which does the same thing in a slightly more Disney World manner. So we see this emergence of molecular style of thought, or what the late and much missed Lily Kay called a molecular vision of life. Wonderful book, if you haven't read it, which charts in very great detail the emergence of this molecular way of thinking about and intervening life from the 1930s onwards, and locates it in some very specific institutional contexts. For me, the important thing about this, for this particular presentation, is what that molecular vision of life does. That breaking down of life into something which can be analyzed at a molecular scale. And at that molecular scale, life becomes mechanism. Life becomes a set of mechanical, although highly complicated, relations which can in principle be understood and can in principle be broken down to the simplest of parts, and where complexity can be thought of as arising because of the combination of these specific parts. My argument, which is probably too difficult to go into in the limited time I have here, is that in this shift we see a fairly fundamental epistemological shift. actually a shift which is of the same level, of the same order as those shifts which Michel Foucault analyzes in his wonderful book, The Order of Things. In The Order of Things, he argues that the modernist way of explaining anything is to see that thing as a surface manifestation of deep underlying laws. The movement of the planets, a manifestation of the deep underlying laws of gravity. Evolution, the manifestation of the deep underlying law of natural selection, and so on. Well, I argue that at this molecular level, you no longer have to understand life at that deep, through one of those deep ontologies. Explain it in terms of underlying fundamental laws. You can understand living processes as cascades, as connections, as circuits, as switches, as relays. Not reduce them. In some way you do reduce them. This is a kind of reductionism, which I mean in a non-pejorative sense, in the sense that it tries to reduce complex processes to the simplest of all parts. But it's not a reductionism that tries to reduce what's happening at one level to what's happening at another level. At least when it's good, it's not. So that, it seems to me, is the logic of molecular biology, and a very powerful logic it's been too. One which has illuminated at that molecular level these fundamental processes, and has done so through both amazing technological advances, highly subtle and sophisticated experiments, and complexity of thinking, which I think puts most things that happen in the social sciences a little bit to shame. But then a long time ago I started out as a biologist, so I have quite a lot of regret now being a lowly sociologist. But there you go. Of course, some argue that this reductionism has run its course, that in our new century we need a new biology, to quote the title of a nice paper by Carl Roser, written a couple of years ago, and that the age at which we can understand complex processes through their simplest parts is probably over. Molecular biology has gone as far as it can go. Now we have to try and think about complexity, emergence, about holism of organisms. And I'll come back to that. Oops, yes, I will come back to that later. This reductionism was implicit in the very birth of the neurosciences. The first use of the term neuroscience was by Francis O. Schmidt in the Neuroscience Research Program, which was founded in 1962. And before Schmidt called it neuroscience, or the neurosciences, he used various other terms for it, one of which was mental biophysics. Mental biophysics, which would bring together the wet, the moist, and the dry, as he put it, bring together the wet, the moist, and the dry in order to attack the most fundamental question of all, the question of the nature of the human brain. So there's a certain reductionism based in this idea that complex mental functions have to be understood one molecule at a time. And we're familiar with these pictures that kind of do that, and they are just there simply as illustrations, although it's interesting, I believe a previous Bochner lecturer, Eric Kandel, made an explicit argument that you should study memory, the most complex of human functions, you might say, one cell at a time. What are the consequences of understanding these complex processes one cell at a time at the level of this molecular biology? Well, I think there are three that I want to just point to you here now. That mental disorders, first of all, obviously, the brain is understood like any other organ. The brain is just an organ. It can be anatomized in terms of the structure of neurons, of synapses, of receptor sites, of ion channels, and so on, as you see in these little pictures here. Each of them is explained in terms of their particular biochemical and molecular properties, and mental disorders and pathologies are increasingly understood as anomalies within these systems. Now, three interesting things happen here. And the first thing is that in this way of thinking, there's no longer the distinction that was quite fundamental to psychiatry, actually into the 20th century, right up through the 20th century, between functional and organic disorders. An organic disorder is where you could find an actual lesion or something going on in the brain. A functional disorder, you could only find a disorder of function. That division no longer exists, or if it does exist, it's a very, very blurred division, and the functional disorder is only functional for as long as you can't find the molecular basis of it. Second division that's blurred is the division between normality and pathology, because normal variations in perception, in cognition and emotion are understood in exactly the same way as pathological variations. They are based on exactly the same molecular mechanisms. And this blurs another boundary that's been absolutely fundamental across the 20th century at least, which is the boundary between states and traits. A psychiatric illness was a state. You had been normal, you got ill, you could get better. That was a state. A trait was a personality trait. It was an enduring feature of your personality, and that was the kind of thing that psychologists dealt with. Psychologists dealt with personality, psychiatrists dealt with pathology. Well, now this distinction between states and traits has also completely blurred, as states and traits, normal variations in mood and abnormal variations in mood, in principle understood in exactly the same way. And third, manipulations of the brain are understood to operate at that level, at that molecular level. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this later, so I won't go on about this, but those of you who are involved in the social studies of psychiatry, I know you're too young, social studies of psychiatry back in the 1960s would know how drugs, psychiatric drugs, were perceived of in those days as chemical koshes, as things which had no specificity of action. Well, in their dreams, at least, every psychiatric drug is conceived of as working through its specific mechanism of action at this molecular level. This is what distinguished so-called distinguished the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and its sisters from previous drugs, because it worked on a specific site within the synaptic cleft in the reuptake mechanism of serotonin. Actually, we know that story, too little serotonin feel miserable, too much serotonin feel high, that story is a complete fantasy, but that's by the by now, because everybody's kind of keen on neuroplasticity. We know now that the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors actually work by stimulating neuroplasticity. At least that's what we know for a while. This dream of molecular specificity is very important for another dimension of this, and this is the dimension of control. I guess many of you will have heard of Ian Wilmot, made famous by the cloning of Dolly the sheep. So when Wilmot writes or is ghost-written his account of cloning Dolly the sheep, he calls it the second creation, Dolly and the age of biological control. Until the birth of Dolly, he says, scientists were apt to declare that this or that procedure was biologically impossible, but now that expression seems to have lost all meaning. In the 21st century and beyond, human ambition will be bound only by the laws of physics, the rules of logic, and our descendants' own sense of right or wrong. Truly, Dolly has taken us into the era of biological control. Well, of course, this was a completely hubristic belief. Nature, as Karl Popper, also at the London School of Economics, said, nature can never say yes to our hypotheses, but it certainly can say no, and it's saying no with increasing frequency. But nonetheless, this dream of biological control is based on the belief that once you know what happens at this molecular level, you can break down living systems into their parts and you can reassemble them. In an area where I'm working kind of by accident at the moment, which is synthetic biology, you see this very, very clearly, the argument that you can break down complex living processes into parts, you can standardize those parts, you can use engineering techniques in order to re-engineer life at the molecular level. More modestly, in the field of biomedicine, what this means is that the biomedical laboratory, rather than a path lab, has become the site of discovery, manipulation, and control of the causes of pathological processes. We take for granted the term biomedicine these days, which implies that medicine should be based on a profound knowledge of basic biology. Actually, this is a very new term. And you can trace the emergence of this term, and you can trace the controversies over this term, that the practice of the cure and the understanding of the basic functioning of the normal human body should be intrinsically related, and therefore that doctors should practice under the aegis, as it were, of basic biomedical medicine, about basic biomedicine. Of course, the dream of that hasn't happened either, which is why there's so much emphasis, certainly in the UK, on the question of translation. Why is it, since we know so much more about these basic biomedical processes, we seem to be able to do not that much more in terms of curing us? That's the argument anyhow. Or, to put it more crudely, why have we spent all this money getting all these Nobel Prizes in biology and neuroscience when we still can't cure cancer or whatever it happens to be? Okay, in Ian Hacking's terms, we've become quite Cartesian about our bodies. We tend to think of our bodies as machines and increasingly about our brains. And we seem to think, therefore, that vitality, that the powers intrinsic in life itself should become kind of available to us as a technical resource which we can use for our own ends. That's what it seems to me is implicit in that dream of biological control. And nowhere is that more salient than in our concerns about the future. Governing the Future. Governing the Future was the title of a parliamentary inquiry in the UK, at which the importance of neurobiology to our future was raised by the then Chief Scientific Officer, Sir David King. What do I mean by governing the future? I mean an ambition to bring our vital futures into our vital present, to make them calculable and to make them manageable. Calculate the future, bring it into the present, manage that future by intervening in the present. Again, in the book, The Politics of Life Itself, I argued that there were two axes of this, which I called susceptibility and optimization. Part of this concern about susceptibility arises from an increasing, about neurosusceptibility, arises from an increasing perception, true or not is not my business, that we are suffering from an epidemic of brain-based disorders, which are going to cause not only enormous personal distress and individual suffering, but place a burden, perhaps an intolerable burden, upon our healthcare systems. 26% of adults not in contact with psychiatric services, so the statistics tell us, are suffering from a DSM-4 diagnosable psychiatric condition in any 1 year, and almost 50% across a lifetime. 127 million Europeans currently living with a brain disorder and these predictions imply that there is a huge burden of the future, which we have to understand by trying to get to grips with the susceptibilities in the present that will generate that future. Hence, the enormous interest which there is at the moment in a number of ways of trying to understand the future in the present. Screening programs, rolling out of screening programs for all sorts of things. Recently, our own health service, our own Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, said that we should have a national health service which was a real health service, and to be a real health service, it had to be a preventive health service, and to be a preventive health service, it had to do, well, that's why I showed this little thing, save lives through screening. Sorry, that, for those of you who don't know, is our current Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, but I won't go there right now. In the genomic field, as many of you, I'm sure, know, the key way in which you try and find these susceptibilities is by looking at the single nucleotide polymorphisms, the small variations where one letter of the genome is substituted for another, a C for a G or an A for a T, and in these small substitutions, not in the major gene 4, but in these small substitutions are supposed to lie all human differences, including differences in susceptibility for diseases. there's been a huge emphasis on one particular type of research here, and that is the so-called genome-wide association studies, which scan the genome at something between 500,000 and 1 million of these SNP sites and try and correlate variations in these SNP sites with your future liability of gaining a disease. Terry Manolio, who's done some very interesting work here, refers to 2007 as the year of genome-wide association studies, and here are some of the areas where there is a claimed susceptibility. Okay, this is not a gene 4, this is a signal perhaps made up of 30 or 40 variations at 30 or 40 sites, none of which is significant on their own, but all of them together amount to an algorithm for your risk. So we get this move to a complete focus on risk. Now, this is a focus on risk from top down, nationally organized screening processes. I was amused to find that little phrase, genes are us, which I'd always taken to be apocryphal, is actually the website of your own National Genome Resource Center here in the United States. And we see a great emphasis on that screening from above, but we also see the reciprocal of that, which is the great emphasis on screening from below. The belief that each individual has a right to know their own future and to take their own future into their own hands. There used to be a TV program on BBC years ago when I was a lad called Your Life in Their Hands, Your Life, the doctor's hands. Now it's my life in my hands, and I want to be scanned, I want to be decoded, I want to read the book of me. Some of you may know that wonderful novelist Richard Powers. If you don't know him, I absolutely recommend reading The Echo Makers, which is a fantastic book. Richard Powers recently was one of the few people who got himself a whole genome scan, and he published it, as I believe, in GQ, which the younger males around must know is some kind of a magazine, under the title The Book of Life or The Book of Me. This is a life scan. This is a commercial organization for scanning and screening. This is the famous Decode Genomics, which for now I think about $570 will offer to tell you your lifetime risk for probably about, I haven't looked recently, probably about 30 complex disorders from restless legs to Alzheimer's disorder. And this is, I believe this is a customer not of decodeme.com, but of 23andme.com. How fascinating. I should know more about myself. For my children, there's something that I could prevent for the future, or live my life in a different way. Why not learn? Why not help myself? Why not understand my own self at the level of that biology? Now, in the psychiatric field, what this amounts to, both from above and from below, is the search for what are called biomarkers. That is to say, the search for biological markers, whether they are something like an eye blink reflex or a skin response or an abnormal brain pattern, which can demonstrate before the event your susceptibility for this event. Biomarkers are the new currency in psychiatry. A biomarker isn't a cause. A biomarker is simply an organic indicator of your increased probability or risk of a future psychiatric disorder. Biomarkers trump behavior in mental illness diagnosis. It says there, biomarkers for psychiatric disorders are a major market. And this report, which was published, which I don't have a time to talk about because I'm talking too long, which was published recently under the title of Optimizing Mental Capital, was absolutely clear in its ambition to optimize the kind of mental capital of the nation by screening, by understanding future susceptibilities, and by intervening early in order to both minimize harm and maximize well-being. Now, if this was a screening program which was all to do with wiping out disorders, you might feel rather concerned about it. But because this is a screening program which is about maximizing well-being, it looks as if there's nothing whatsoever problematic in it, and perhaps indeed there isn't. Here's the life course, and here's what they say. It's important for the well-being of the individual, and indeed it's important for the well-being of the nation. So the new rationality that's taking shape here, which I call rather mischievously, using a phrase from a form of phrase from Michel Foucault, not discipline and punish, but screen and intervene. Screen and intervene has many sides to it. Screen and intervene from above, screen and intervene from below, screen and intervene coercively on children who you think might be developing behavioral disorders, screen and intervene through the mechanism of commodity and commercial